Welcome to Kevin Makes Cool Things. I'm Kevin, and today I'm making the Demon King's daggers from the solo leveling manhwa for a second time. I already made this dagger and every other dagger that Jinwoo uses throughout the series last year as part of my solo leveling dagger challenge, but today I'm going back and making a different version. The Demon King's daggers, as the name suggests, are something that Jinwoo gets by defeating the Demon King Baran. When Baran is using these daggers, they have this really cool dragon skull on the hilt, but when Jinwoo gets them and uses them throughout the rest of the series, they have this large eyeball. The last time I made this, I went for the version with the eyeball, because it's what we see most of the time, but today I'm going back and doing the version specifically with the dragon skull. Shout out to Grancoda for reaching out to me on Thingiverse and recommending I make this. When they originally asked, I told them that I had other things on my plate, but then I kept thinking about it and here we are. Let's dive in and start by finding a reference image, which is going to be surprisingly easy because this version of the dagger only shows up in one chapter of the manhwa. The Demon King only uses these daggers in chapter 87 of the manhwa, right before he's killed. What we see here is everything I have to go on. I can see a little bit of the pommel, but there's no indication about how the grip is supposed to attach to the blade. As I was cutting together these graphics, I realized we actually do see this design again when Jinwoo is fighting the ants. It's subtle, and I've never noticed it before, despite reading this series several times. I don't think this would have changed my design much either way, because this image doesn't add much new information. At this point, I'm going to stop, and address the comments I'll inevitably get about the details being wrong. I got a lot of these on my last set of daggers, and while it was an interesting conversation to have in the comments, this time, I'm going to try to handle it all as part of the actual video. I've said this before, and I'll say it again now, but the art of solo leveling is inconsistent. That's especially true in this case. At the start of the chapter, we see a dragon skull on the inside of both daggers. Later in this same chapter, we see an eyeball design. There's a similar issue with the blade length. If you actually extrapolate this out, this is more of a machete than a dagger, so the length is going to need some adjusting. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the art of solo leveling, and I wouldn't change a thing about the manhwa, but these inconsistencies do make this kind of project significantly more difficult. I deal with this to some extent on any project I do, involving manga, anime, or even light novels. It's just especially exaggerated in this case. This is one reason why I really stress finding a good reference image, because it lets you avoid all of this headache. I chose this image as my reference because it was my best option. Going into this, I knew I was going to be designing a lot of this dagger from scratch. On projects like this, my goal isn't to perfectly replicate the prop, which would be impossible in many cases, but rather to do something that's true to the spirit of the designs, even if I have to adjust the details a little bit. In this case, because the reference image left so much out, I had to come to terms with the fact that I was really just making my interpretation. In GIMP, I started by deciding on the measurements. Last time I made the Demon King's dagger, it felt too short, so this time I'm going for 24 inches, or 600 millimeters in total length. Other times, you see me carefully tracing props with a path tool in my mouse. In this case, I'm just using my drawing tablet and tracing everything with my stylus. It's a lot messier, but that's not going to matter in this case. This is going to require so much rework in Blender that I'm not going to waste time polishing a sketch in GIMP when it's not going to move the project forwards. In Blender, I started with the dragon skull, which was going to be the most challenging part of the project. This was the entire reason I decided to do this. I haven't done much modeling like this before, and I thought it would be a great challenge. It didn't take long for me to realize that I can't model a dragon skull from scratch. I abandoned this attempt and went back to GIMP. At this point, I had a better idea of what I needed in a reference, so I made some updates to the designs and did end up using the path tool to carefully outline the blade. It's frustrating to backtrack like this, but I've learned that it ends up being faster to go back and fix things properly than continue pushing ahead. Updating the reference and starting over probably took me a few minutes, but in the end, it saved me a couple of hours throughout the modeling process. As part of this, I went onto Thingiverse and found a low poly dragon skull from Skyrim. There are a few versions of this, and I'm not sure who made it originally, but a huge amount of credit to that person. I spent the next week trying to 3D model this skull. At first, I tried using a new mesh to trace over the Skyrim skull model, which went alright. Next, I actually took the Skyrim model and deleted off all the parts I didn't need and used that as a base for my modeling, which went better, but I still made some big mistakes. I think either of these approaches are valid, and it was just a matter of me getting enough experience through trial and error. For my third attempt, I tried tracing over this again with a new mesh, and this time it worked. I'm pretty pleased with how this turned out. It's not at the level of a professional, but I think it's really cool that someone like me, with no formal 3D modeling training, can make something like this with just free software. If you have some ideas and are debating whether or not it's worth trying to build some of this stuff, I'd recommend you give it a shot. It's amazing what you can accomplish, even if you have to hack it together at points. I added the horns next. I'm planning to print these separately, so I can do a nice job sanding everything. I made the blade in the same way as all my other daggers. I started with a plane, then extruded it to create one side, then mirrored everything to create the other side. I made the scales in the same way as the blade. I traced the areas, extruded everything upwards, and applied a subdivision surface modifier to finish making one side, then used a mirror modifier so it appeared on the other side as well. Overall, I like how these look. I had to do a lot of improvisation here, but I think I stayed true to the original designs. The one thing I'm not satisfied with is how I constructed these meshes. I think it will be fine once everything's printed and sanded, but the model is kinda lumpy. There's definitely a better way to construct this, I'm just not sure what it is. For both the back of the blade and the pommel, I ended up copying this scale from the bottom of the guard and adjusting it. This saved me a lot of time, and I think it does a nice job giving the entire design a unified feel. Once I was finished modeling, I moved everything into Repetier Host to repair it. This probably wouldn't be necessary if I was a better modeler, but I do what I can. I also made a version of this dagger without the skull and horns, which I had already separated off to print separately. After I repaired everything, I imported this full dagger back into Blender and divided it up. I made a number of small channels for bits of finishing nail to go between these pieces to help align everything during gluing. Each of these cubes has a few Boolean modifiers. Most of them are difference modifiers to cut out the channels for the nails. The last one is an intersect modifier with the imported dagger model, which cuts this down to size. This is my preferred method for dividing up larger models for printing. In the manhwa, the Demon King uses two of these daggers, which appear to be identical, at least for the most part. When it came time to print this, I decided I was only going to print and finish one of these. That's enough for me to make this video, and I'm not going to waste the time and materials making a second one when it's not really necessary. If you're planning to use these for a costume or something, you can just print the parts twice and repeat all the steps. Things generally printed pretty well, but I had one piece of the blade that kept failing. I made a modified version to compensate for the weak supports and force this to print properly. I attached the pieces together with 2-part epoxy over the course of a few days. I had a problem with one of these pieces not lining up with the others. I'm not quite sure what the issue is, because everything looks fine in Blender. This is the same piece I had to modify to get to print properly, so it might be something weird to do with that. Normally, after attaching everything together, I'll do a rough pass with my Dremel tool before moving on to more hand sanding. As part of that, I just sanded down this area, so it's no longer noticeable. I tried something a little bit different on this project. Generally, I apply wood filler and do sanding, and then once I'm totally done with that step, I'll move on to applying some spray-on sandable primer before moving on to painting. Sometimes I will go back and do some more sanding depending on how things look, but not always. In this case, I applied a light coat of wood filler, did a bit of sanding, and then applied a single coat of spray-on sandable primer before going back and doing it all again. The advantage of this is the spray-on sandable primer really highlights the areas that need work, so I think I was a little more efficient. I'm not convinced, but I'm glad I experimented. I paid special attention to finishing the dragon skulls. These are going to be the centerpiece of the design, so I want to make sure they look especially nice. The blade was less of a concern, because I would be painting it black, which would hide a lot of imperfections. Unfortunately, some of the spikes either broke off or didn't print properly, so I had to reconstruct them with wood filler. This wasn't my proudest moment, but it worked. I started painting the blade, skulls, and horns separately. I figured this would result in a cleaner paint job than if I tried to attach everything together before painting. The horns have some black rings on them, which are probably supposed to be in 3D, but I ignored that detail while modeling because I figured it would be too detailed for my printer. I painted these rings on by hand. I didn't do a great job, but I actually think the shaky and inconsistent lines look pretty good, or at least that's what I'm telling myself. Once things had dried, I attached the horns to the skulls, and then attached the first of these skulls to the dagger. I had 2 holes going through the dagger to help position these skulls, but things didn't quite line up. At this point, I nearly ruined the project. I was running low on time, because I do try to post these videos consistently, so I decided to cut corners on the gluing. After giving the first skull only a few hours to dry, I flipped everything over and attached the second skull, at which point I realized the first one had fallen off. I propped everything in position, and thankfully it did dry correctly in the end, but it was a really close call. I'm honestly not sure how well these skulls are attached, and that's one of my big regrets about the design for the dagger. As I've been working on this, I'm half expecting to walk in the room and find that one's fallen off. I used some black paint to clean up the blade. Some bits of 2-part epoxy did get smeared on this as I was adjusting the position of these skulls. Going forwards, I'm only ever going to purchase clear 2-part epoxy because this has been such a pain. I sprayed everything with a clear matte sealer to finish off the painted portions. I was trying to cover all of the little nooks and crannies and ended up applying way too much sealer. This happens on almost every project, and I always promise myself that I'll be more careful next time, but it's so easy to go overboard with this stuff. When the light is at the right angle, you can see a few drips, which is unfortunate. Once this was dry, I painted the grip black. I'm going to be wrapping all of this, so you shouldn't be able to see this, but I like to put down a base coat just so my little mistakes aren't as obvious. I use superglue to attach the wrapping, which is always a messy process because I don't have the best track record with superglue. And that wraps up the project. I think this is definitely the most impressive thing I've made to date. Whether it was the modeling, the finishing, or generally how it looks as a finished product, I am super proud of this. To give you a sense, this is the dagger I made last time, and I think you can see that going for the 24 inches as opposed to the 18 was definitely the right call. If you want to make your own, I'll post all the files on Thingiverse, and there'll be a link in the video's description. If you want to tell YouTube that this video is worth watching, then please go ahead and give it a like. If you want to support the channel and see my other projects, then go ahead and subscribe.